Today we're going to take a look at a part of Manchester that enjoyed an illustrious 140-year history. It's hard to believe today, in modern times, when you look at this rather dour modern-day landscape of concrete and steel, that there in fact was the Bellvue Zoological Gardens. I expect there'll be many of you who've got your own memories as to what the old complex was all about, but there'll be many of you who don't remember Bellevue at all. Those of you who don't, Bellevue, if you like, was a modern-day equivalent of being a gigantic theme park, a bit like Alton Towers and Blackpool Pleasure Beach all mixed into one. But Bellevue in its heyday was far more than that. There was a gigantic speedway stadium, a massive zoo, a huge fun fair, boxing, wrestling, brass band contests, pop concerts. There was everything here. You could say it was Manchester's equivalent of being its arts and leisure all under the one roof. You get some idea to the size of the site by having a look at it from our aerial camera. The Bellevue site in total was between 75 and 95 acres in total area, stretched along Kirkmanshaw Lane, where of course the Greyhound Stadium was built in the 1920s, and the Greyhound Stadium was of course part of the overall complex then. Redgate Lane of course was where the long-site entrance was, and this joined Hyde Road, and we travel up there for about half a mile where we find of course the Lake Hotel. It was a massive site. It attracted millions of visitors. Well, what we're going to do now is to trace back the early history of Bellevue and see if we can revive some of the things that you may well best remember.
Perhaps the best place to find out about the early days of Bellevue's history is here at Manchester's historic Chetham's Library. A large collection of material was stored there by members of the Jennison family. The history books say it was the Jennison family who ran Bellevue until 1925. But it was John Jennison in particular who took over the area in 1836. Jennison was a man of vision and kept a small animal collection at his strawberry gardens in Adswood, Stockport. This proved popular with the public, and soon it was suggested to him to move his animals to a larger site, to Bellevue in Gorton, Manchester. But what was Bellevue like in its early years? Local historian Robert Nichols takes up the story.
At first, very small scale, with the public gardens extending to no more than a couple of acres. However, Jennison gradually extended the area by buying or leasing adjacent plots of land. So much so that in the early years at Bellevue he nearly outstretched himself. An attempt was made to declare him bankrupt in 1842. He escaped from this predicament by the skin of his teeth. As you trace Bellevue's early history, its growth is apparent. The first guidebook was issued in 1847. Of course, Jennison realised that to keep the public returning to his gardens, attractions and events would have to be laid on. Foot races, swimming competitions, kite flying displays, fireworks spectacles, and even an event where a man was seen to be walking on water were the type of attraction that fell into this category. At the same time, Jennison was quick to realise and exploit the added accessibility to the gardens that came from the continued expansion of the railway system at this period. The station for Bellevue was provided at Longsight as early as 1842. The first known excursion train to Bellevue ran in 1847.
Firework displays and brass band contests were to prove very popular, but when did they start?
Well, they both came about as a direct result of a visit John Jennison made with his wife to the 1851 Great Exhibition in London. Whilst there, he witnessed the value of music at such events, and he also saw the colossal firework displays put on at London's Surrey Zoological Gardens. Whilst there, he asked George Danson, the scenic artist at the Surrey Zoological Gardens, to come to Manchester and organise similar displays at Bellevue. From 1852 onwards, the Bellevue firework displays were transformed. A large scenic background called the picture was painted, and men were employed to act out a scene of some historical event, usually a battle. The one for 1852 was called the Bombardment of Algiers, and it was very successful. The musical contests were also designed to bring the crowds to Bellevue. A drum and fife contest was tried in 1852, with the first brass band contest the following year. On the day of the contest, an audience of 16,000 turned up. Jennison had a large family, 7 sons and 2 daughters. Many of these were involved in the running of the gardens, and they kept a tight rein on everything and meticulously recorded the income and expenditure for every day. Here's a good example. It's for Easter Monday, April the 14th, 1879. It shows that they collected £949, 1 shilling and 7pence, and that the weather was fine with a cold east wind. Bellevue in the Jennison era had quite a high degree of self-sufficiency. They baked their own bread and pies, generated their own gas and electricity, brewed their own beer. They even provided their own bricks to build the 14-foot high wall that surrounded the gardens until very recently. They made many of their own fireworks. John Jennison died in 1869, and the gardens were run by 4 of his sons. Further developments took place, and many of the animal houses that survived until the end of the zoo were built in this period. My own view is that Bellevue reached a level of maturity as an enterprise in the late Victorian era, having established for itself a reputation of regional and national importance. The fortunes of Bellevue began to take a downward slide in the early years of this century, and the First World War and the troubled economic conditions thereafter did not help. By this time, control of the gardens was in the hand of the 3rd generation of the family, not all of whom were committed to running the place, and some wanted to sell up. In the end, these people were in the majority. By 1925, the gardens had been sold to a newly created company called Bellvue Manchester Limited, controlled by Sir William Gentle, Captain Philip Hodge and John Henry Isles. In the same year, the Greyhound Racing Association was formed with the aim of bringing the new American sport of greyhound racing to this country. Sir William Gentleman became chairman of the new association, and the Bellevue Company leased an area of its land at the top end of Kirkmanshume Lane to the association, where they built a stadium to cater for the new sport. On the 27th of July 1926, the first greyhound race in this country was held at the new stadium.
The choice of the Northwest to stage the British premiere of the sport was deliberate, as it was hoped that the area's coursing tradition would help this form of entertainment. The stadium was built at a cost of £22,000. In 1928, a new sport was to arrive in this country, that of dirt track racing, better known today as speedway. In July 1928, the first meeting was held at this stadium under the control of the North Manchester Motorcycle Club, run by E.O. Spence. The Aces were soon to move to a purpose-built stadium, returning here in 1988. It was Australian Johnny Hoskins who brought the sport to Britain in 1928, and ironically, he became the Aces team manager in the 50s. Hoskins was also Bellevue's publicity officer, and his time spent at Bellevue is commemorated by a street name on the current Wimpey housing estate. The newly established company invested heavily in Bellevue after 1925. One of the directors, John Henry Isles, who had been responsible for the amusement park at the 1924 exhibition at Wembley, decided to transfer a number of rides to Bellevue. These included the Scenic Railway, and shortly afterwards, in 1929, a second roller coaster was introduced, called the Bobs. It cost £1 a ride, travelled at a mile a minute, and became world famous. fortunes of the zoo began to rise when Gerald Isles, John Henry's nephew, was appointed director. Zoologist and writer Clinton Keeling explains the key changes to Bellevue Zoo.
Now, what were the sort of significant animal enclosures that were constructed, do you think, around that time?
Some were very impressive, and the only ones of their kind in the country. For example, there was the huge gibbon cage, a very, very large structure which gave these animals ample scope for their very, very notable acrobatic abilities. And just beyond this, there was the Monkey Mountain, a huge pile of artificial rockwork surrounded by water. And this was fronted by a floral clock, which was something of a novelty in those days. Yeah. It made up the area called the Centenary Gardens. They were constructed during the winter of 1935 to 36, and they were opened officially by the Lord Mayor of Manchester at Easter 1936 to commemorate the place's centenary. They were set out with beautiful flower beds too, and they gave a wonderful impression. They were the first enclosures you saw as you walked in through the main gate, through the turnstile, and turned right, and here were the magnificent Centenary Gardens. But another remarkable enclosure was the Rocky Mountain enclosure. This was in the middle of the gardens, adjacent to the paddock house. It covered, I should say, about a third of an acre. It's a mass of artificial rockwork, crags, and even a ravine. There was a large pool fed by a fountain that cascaded down from under the rocks. And it was home to various ungulates or hoofed animals, such as deer, wild sheep, and wild goats. It was the only enclosure of its kind in the country, and was based on the revolutionary methods of the great Carl Hagenbeck, who pioneered such animal keeping techniques at the Hamburg Zoological Garden in Germany.
Well, let's now, just for a moment or two, Clinton, let's run a bit of film through, and you can perhaps talk us through the Bellevue Zoo around that time. So we'll just play that on the monitor for us. We have the shot of the snakes. This is probably before the sort of conventional reptile house, if you like, more of a...
No, that was the open-air reptilium, which was built in 1929. The reptile house was built about the turn of the century. The snakes we can see are the diced water snake from southern Europe, and as the name tells you, they are very aquatic, very much at home in water. The diced water snake. If you look carefully, you can see the markings are rather like the markings on a draft board, if you stretch your imagination somewhat.
Yeah. And we see this shot quite often, the monkey riding a bike.
Yes, the monkey was Peter. In the background, by the way, is the very impressive monkey house built in 1872.
Because this is the sort of thing the public used to like seeing, isn't it, in monkeys
Yes.
coming out for a ride? Yeah.
This has now been stopped, and it's a great pity. There's no fun now in visiting a zoological garden. Notice, by the way, the very impressive flower beds in the background, which were so much a part of Bellevue. That is the red kangaroo, and the species bred at Bellevue. That's in the kangaroo enclosure.
Yeah.
There is Doreen, the baby giraffe, with her mother, Mary. Doreen was born at Easter 1938, and she lived until the 1950s. That's the Cavarondo crane from West Africa. There's quite a group there in the kangaroo enclosure.
And these shots show what a beautiful place it was, isn't it?
It was
really?
indeed.
Nice,
It was a place very well cared for and loved. That was the old deer enclosure, or deer park, which was at the edge of the gardens, at the back of the bear pits. To our right, there was the wall, which was the place's barrier, and there it's occupied by alpacas.
Now here we have another example of particularly the monkeys coming out to entertain the public. So would a monkey sort of enjoy this being a
It's
boxing?
very good occupational therapy. I know there are some today who'd say that it's degrading for a wild animal to be forced to behave in that way, but it's very good occupational therapy. That's poor old Peter again. And notice he's obviously on very good terms with his keeper.
Looks like people used to come in there for a cup of tea and a sandwich and watch a boxing match, you know. So is that the monkey's actually enjoying that?
That's the interior of the monkey house, yes. That's where he lived.
That'll be the monkey keeper there.
Yes, yes.
Ring with him, yeah. This is in between the rounds then, you know, a drink. What would the monkey be drinking then?
Probably milk.
No. Clinton, of all the animals at Bellevue, the Tygon is often talked about because a beautiful creature,
Sure,
a rare creature. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, Maud, with her brother Clou, which by the way is Siamese for tiger, were born the result of a mating between a Manchurian tiger and an African lioness at the Dresden Zoological Garden in Germany in 1932. And they came to Bellevue, coincidentally, via the Hamburg Zoological Garden, which has just been mentioned. Clou died from tuberculosis in 1942, but Maud lived to be 18, which is a good age for a big cat. She was a very impressive creature, like a large, rather dark-coloured lioness, but with the characteristic markings, the stripes, of a tiger.
The Bellevue Company had to find uses for the Speedway Stadium on the days when the aces were not riding. A series of military tattoos were tried in the early 1930s. However, the stadium was often used for political and social rallies. This short film of 1939 Cooperative Rally was made by members of the Bolton Cooperative Film Unit. The rally progresses along Ardwick Green up to Hyde Road and then on to Bellevue. On a dull and at times a windy day, the men, women and children of the cooperative movement look quite colourful in their homemade costumes, representing far-off lands and peoples. We also see the year's cooperative queen, and finally the participants link up on the grass to form words and slogans of the movement. train to Bellevue was full of Speedway fans as they made their way to the stadium. Speedway was also to run during the wartime, as clerk of the course for over 50 years, Alan Moray tells us.
We were very fortunate. When the war came, Bellevue bought the stock of Erskine bikes. So Bellevue had plenty of bikes.
What did they used to run the bikes on? I mean, presumably fuel must have been...
Wood alcohol, they were all right.
Yeah, sort of alcoholic
Dope.
mixture. Dope.
Yeah, dope.
Of course, I mean, the crowds used to really...
Terrific crowds.
Yeah, fantastic crowds, weren't they?
If you look at some of the old photographs,
Yeah.
I mean, one week it'd be Eric Chitty's team versus Jack Parker, and next week North versus South. Then you'd have England versus overseas.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, parts of the fun fair were running as well, weren't they?
Oh, yeah.
They were very keen to get the Speedway sort of done and finished, so as people go around the rides afterwards, is that right?
Correct, yeah. And as the days shortened, Speedway started earlier.
Yeah.
Quarter to 7, 6:30, 6:15, 6 o'clock, and then finished till the following Easter.
Am I right in saying they used to have fireworks at this place?
After the war.
It was after the war?
Oh, yes.
Right.
9 o'clock on the island. The storming of Quebec, the relief of Mafeking. Oh, great. We had to finish at 5 to 9.
Right.
They were on the phone from the main gates at Hyde Road. If Speedway was still running when the first cannon went off at 9 o'clock, because every minute after 9 o'clock that Speedway ran was pounds lost in the pleasure beach, pleasure park.
The King's Hall, constructed in the early 19th century, was to become another world-famous venue for Bellevue. Brass band contests, dancing, circus shows, boxing and wrestling, all taking place here. The circus also ran during the war in very difficult circumstances. Lockhart stayed with the company until 1972.
Here's a Bellevue Circus contract with James Chipperfield. The contract signed for and on behalf of Bellevue management by George Lockhart. And James Chipperfield is to present a group of 5 lions, 2 bulls and 1 horse, the act, a comedy riding act, and a Liberty Horse act.
The circus also ran during the war, but shortly after that it was at its peak, with a wide variety of acts as shown by this short film made by Mancunian Studios.